Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. For those joining us online, we welcome them as well, and those that will be joining us on a future occasion on C-SPAN Book TV. For those in-house, we would ask if you would check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as a courtesy. And for those watching online, we remind you that you're welcome at any time to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program on our Heritage homepage as soon as today's events are over for your future reference. Leading our discussion and welcoming our guest is Ryan Anderson. Dr. Anderson is our William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy. He is also the founder and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. He is the author of Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, and co-authored with Princeton's Robert George and Sharif Gurkas the book, What is Marriage? Man and a Woman, a Defense. He earned his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and his doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Anderson. Ryan.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Today, we're really in for a treat. While all around us, people in power try to deny the obvious, that men and women are equal but not the same, Ashley McGuire has written a timely and important book responding to the drive to abolish male and female. McGuire is a senior fellow with the Catholic Association. She writes and speaks widely about religious freedom, Catholicism, and women. She has appeared on CNN, CBS, Fox, PBS, EWTN, and the BBC. And her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, Time Magazine, First Things, the Weekly Standard, the Federalist, the New York Post, and the Huffington Post. Her new book, Sex Scandal, McGuire explores debates about women in the military and women in the workforce, the campus hookup culture, and campus gender identity policies. She explores gender-neutral parenting and gender-equitable homemaking. McGuire's arguments may not shock many people in today's audience, but they come with a trigger warning when delivered on college campuses, and perhaps we should issue that warning for Book TV. Her basic thesis: we best protect women's equality and dignity when we stop trying to make women and men the same. Today, she'll give us a taste of some of her arguments in her new book. Please join me in welcoming Ashley McGuire to the podium.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you very much to the Heritage Foundation for having me. Especially thank you to my good friend Roger Severino. I'd like to open with a quote that, at least in this brave new internet world of fake news, is attributed to Plato. Quote, "Strange times are these in which we live, when old and young are taught falsehoods in school, and the person that dares to tell the truth is called at once a lunatic and a fool." I suspect that most of you are here today because you are interested and perhaps distressed by the reality that it has become anathema to speak the truth about sex. Not the sex that most people immediately think of when they hear the word, but sex as it demarcates male and female, two of the most patently obvious and self-evident realities since time immemorial. That right there has become a matter of national scandal, one that continues to play out almost daily. In just the few short weeks since my book has come out, countless examples making headline news have confirmed just how askew our society has found itself when it comes to sexual reality. The week that my book was released, for example, the Boy Scouts announced that it will essentially go co-ed by allowing members of either biological sex to participate. To quote their CEO, "We realize that referring to birth certificates as the reference point is no longer sufficient." When I heard this, I wondered how long until the Girl Scouts was pressured to go in the same direction, only to learn after some brief research that the Girl Scouts had already announced that biological boys could participate if they self-identified as girls. The following week, the British Medical Association published guidelines for employers suggesting that the phrase expectant mother was not inclusive enough, and proposed instead the phrase pregnant people, in addition to suggesting that people use the phrase chest feeding instead of breastfeeding, lest someone be offended by the fact that women, and only women, can bear and birth children. This may seem laughable, and yet it comes in the wake of the Midwives Alliance of North America introducing the phrase birthing individual into their lexicon. When the alliance received angry blowback from some feminists, such as iconic feminist midwife Ina May Gaskin, one writer who described himself as an expectant parent lamented at the Huffington Post that some women had the audacity to, quote, assert that only women have the ability to give birth, and that such capacity is what women should celebrate about themselves. A few days later, the iconic doll company familiar, no doubt, to every young woman in this room, American Girl, came out with its first ever doll that is a boy, or at least looks like a boy. One woman on the website Mashable praised the company for making, quote, greater strides towards inclusivity because goodness forbid that little girls have a corner of the toy industry all to themselves. Finally, I offer one more example that's currently making headline news, the still unfolding scandal of nude photo sharing of female Marines. As NPR recently reported, quote, the Pentagon is investigating the image sharing, and in the past 24 hours, both CBS News and Business Insider have reported that members of other branches of the U.S. military were involved in similar activities, and that online bulletin boards were being used to either share or solicit nude or explicit photos and videos of women in the military. A visit to one of the image sharing sites Friday confirmed that it was still active. This was from just a day or two ago. In each of these examples, women in particular get the short end of the gender-neutral stick. Underage girls are potentially endangered by a policy that places them in close quarters, potentially overnight, with prepubescent boys, and certainly in the case of the Boy Scouts, adult men. Pregnant women are an offense for celebrating their essential contribution to perpetuating humanity. A company called American Girl is not inclusive if it does not also market to boys. And women in our armed forces are systematically degraded and violated in the aftermath of major upheavals to military policy that included opening all combat roles to women and forcing the Marines to make its infamous boot camp co-ed. We have indeed become completely scandalized by sex, and in my book, I argue that it is women who have the most to lose in a world marching onwards towards gender neutrality. Contrary to popular opinion, equal treatment does not yield equal outcomes. Rather, it almost always has the effect of disempowering women by holding them to male standards against which we are almost always doomed to fail. In the remainder of my time, I'd like to do four things. I'd like to step back and talk a bit about the language of the debate in the gender wars. I'd then like to give what I think are three of the most powerful examples of what happens to women in a world that denies sex. And then I'd like to speak briefly about how it is that we got to this place and a bit about why I think there's still cause for hope. As George Orwell put it, if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. One word has had a hugely corrosive effect on social thinking surrounding sex, and that word is gender. I am asked often about the difference between the meaning of sex and gender, and I've basically boiled it down to this. Sex means something, gender means nothing. Sex has a definition, a pretty uniform one that you can find in just about any medical textbook or scientific resource. It means male and female as denoted by one's chromosomes and genitalia. Period. Full stop. The definition of gender, on the other hand, is something even the gender identity movement is struggling to pin down. I give you the example of Facebook, which in 2015 experimented with moving away from the boring but scientifically straightforward choices of male or female. The social media platform expanded to offer 70-something selections that included choices like pangender, demi-boy, and two-spirit. Facebook was not expecting to get raked over the progressive coals for this inclusive gesture, but rather than praise, the company incurred endless criticism for failing to include this gender or that, eventually winding up replacing all of the options with a simple fill-in-the-blank, which eventually became other. One professor addressed the question of how to even put down boundaries around the meaning of gender and the expansive number of choices once science is no longer relevant. He wrote, quote, once we assert that the problem with gender is that we currently recognize only two of them, the obvious question to ask is, how many genders would we have to recognize in order to not be oppressive? Just how many possible gender identities are there? The only consistent answer to this is 7 billion, give or take. There are as many possible gender identities as there are humans on the planet. Your gender can be frost, or the sun, or music, or the sea, or Jupiter, or pure darkness. Your gender can be pizza. But what becomes of women in a world where we have the same legal status as pizza. So I'm going to read briefly from the opening of my chapter on the military, which I think highlights what happens. In February 2010, then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates announced that the Navy would lift its long-standing ban on female sailors serving aboard submarines. Women had been permitted to serve aboard surface ships for more than a decade, but submarines presented a unique challenge to the Navy's ongoing integration efforts: very cramped quarters, minimal privacy, and tours as long as 3 months at sea. The Navy was worried that locking up a group of men and women in a small metal tube underwater for 3 straight months might cause less than ideal things to transpire between the sexes. That's exactly what happened. The USS Wyoming was one of the first submarines to bring women sailors on board, and was one of the first 2 submarines to see a woman receive her dolphins and become a submarine officer. Dozens more women followed suit, and the Navy proudly announced that sex integration aboard subs was smooth sailing. But in 2014, a rumor began circulating aboard the USS Wyoming. Word on the nearby USS West Virginia was that lewd videos were being filmed aboard the Wyoming. A formal investigation confirmed the appalling truth. A ring of male sailors had been collaborating for more than a year to film female sailors in the showers and share those videos with fellow shipmen. This was not just a one-time prank that went viral. This was a calculated and collaborative effort that implicated dozens of men who stood guard and covered for one another while they used banned electronic devices like iPods to film women as they undressed and bathed. On one 3-month patrol, reports later revealed, every single woman aboard the USS Wyoming was filmed naked every single time she took a shower. The incident should have been a shocking wake-up call for senior military officials. Women were systematically violated for months on end because a policy agenda built on blindness to sexual difference tore down long-standing barriers designed to protect both women and the integrity of the Navy. But rather than hit the pause button, the Navy gave the perpetrators a slap on the wrist and pressed towards its next goal, integrating nuclear-powered Virginia-class attack subs and eventually all enlisted ranks on submarines. In an even more stunning move, then Defense Secretary Ash Carter announced that the Pentagon would be opening every single combat role to women. Elite forces were not excluded, and the process had to begin in 30 days. Even more stunning, Secretary Carter referred to gender integration on submarines as an example of previous success in this department. He failed to mention the ongoing media fallout about the shower spying. The Marines resisted this move not because they are sexist, but because they had actually spent time and tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money studying what happens in mixed-sex combat units. The findings of the Marine study were devastating for proponents of sex integration. Mixed-gender units performed worse than all-male ones by significant margins in every single metric. Overall, male units fared better 69% of the time in the area of speed, which the Marines consider one of the 2 most important metrics for combat readiness. All-male squadrons were faster than mixed-sex squadrons in every single tactical movement. All-male units were noticeably more accurate in their aim with every single weapon system. The male units engaged targets more quickly and scored more hits than mixed-gender ones. The study even found that the male infantry with no formal rifle training performed with greater accuracy than women who had received formal training. But the study went beyond measuring speed and accuracy and considered the physical impact of placing women into combat roles alongside men. Those findings were equally devastating. Women in the study suffered injuries at a staggering 6 times the rate of their male counterparts. Not only were women more likely to develop an injury related to the grueling work, but they were also slower at getting an injured Marine off the battlefield, an especially concerning result. One female Marine pointed out the high stakes involved, and I quote her saying, "No one questions why there aren't any female athletes in the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, etc. Olympic athletes are the elite of the elites. No one questions why the women compete against women and men against men." I would contest that, but she goes on to say, "There are great sports and achievements, but lives and missions are on the line. In our world, if you move slower one day, you don't get bumped off the medal stand. You could die or get someone else killed." Former Marine Tom Nevin put it more bluntly, "The only possible outcome of this policy is a more dead Marines." In short, while women are now given an equal opportunity to fight on every front line, we know that they have an unequal chance of surviving without injury. Briefly, I will give two more examples of how a sex-blind approach harms women. The next is the modern college campus, recently labeled by CNBC as, quote, one of the most dangerous places for women in America. No one dares suggest, however, that this has something to do with co-ed housing, which has long become the norm on most college campuses. Something like 90% of college dorms in America are co-ed, many by floor, many by hallway, many by bathroom, and increasingly many by room. Schools are actually trending towards co-ed dorm rooms, despite plain statistics published by our own federal government that found that in 2014, for example, 74% of all reported rapes at college, 82% of reported on-campus rapes, and 53% of what they termed on-campus fondlings happened in student housing. Another extensive study conducted over the course of a decade on rape and sexual assault in colleges in Massachusetts found that 81% of reported rapes and sexual assaults took place in a dorm versus just 9% in houses and apartments and a stunningly low 4% in fraternities. And yet schools are pressing forward with even more sex integration, often forced even in the most private of spaces. In the book, I give the example of Harvard University, which in the aftermath of former President Larry Summers daring to propose that there are some aspects of our maleness and femaleness that are not social constructs, the school went on a gender equity campaign that sought in part to address the campus rape issue by telling students that they would be punished if they participated in single-sex clubs. Never mind, as the Wall Street Journal noted, that the school had an equal number of such clubs for males and females. Students who were in these clubs would be ineligible for things like school endorsement for scholarships and sports teams captaincies. The school was not prepared for the response, which included hundreds of female students, many of them victims of sexual assault, angrily marching through campus claiming that the school was taking away their safe spaces, and launching a Twitter campaign with hashtags such as "Assault is not our fault" and "Hear her, Harvard." The school's reaction was to call the women discriminatory by issuing a public statement that dripped with condescension. Quote, "Change is difficult and is often met initially by opposition. That was certainly true with past steps to remove gender barriers at Harvard. And yet few today would reverse those then controversial decisions. We continue to believe that gender discrimination has no place on Harvard's campus." In other words, women are sexist for demanding single-sex safe spaces even when they have been assaulted on account of their sex. Or, as one of my favorite columnists and Harvard graduate Naomi Schaefer Riley put it, Harvard told its women to go where the rapes are. The last example I'll give is that of girls in women's sports because it implicates Title IX and demonstrates the legal erasure of women under the mantra of equality. Bernice Sandler, dubbed the godmother of Title IX, called the legislation that she helped to draft, quote, "the most important step for gender equality since the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote." Title IX, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, not gender, but sex, helped to pave the way for women's sports, which created opportunities for millions of women and girls. Its passage saw a 1,079% increase in female participation in sports, which didn't take away from boys and men's sports, which still grew by 22% in that same period. Multiple generations of girls, such as myself, have since grown up experiencing athletics as a means to build self-esteem, leadership skills, friendships, and for some, a path to scholarships and lucrative professional opportunities. Title IX was designed to correct for unequal opportunities for women. Where no sports team was offered for a girl, she could play with the boys, and schools had to prove that they were making a good faith effort to invest equally in both boys and girls' sports. But now, under the gender theory regime, Title IX is being co-opted to permit boys to play on girls' sports teams too. The phenomenon went mostly unnoticed until 2011, when male high school senior Will Higgins competed in a girls' state swim meet in Massachusetts. He won the 50-yard freestyle race and broke the meet record with a time that would not have even qualified him to compete in the same race in the boys' division. The lead paragraph of a Boston Globe article covering the controversy that ensued was Orwellian. Quote, the governing body that regulates high school athletics in Massachusetts is taking a closer look at the controversy surrounding mixed-gender swim teams and will soon address the issue of boys breaking girls' swimming records. That same fall, boys competed on 8 different high school girls' swim teams in Massachusetts, and several of the boys qualified to compete at the state level. As the Globe summed up the situation, athletic officials are limited in what they can do. In the eyes of the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association, there's no stopping boys from competing on girls' swim teams because state law mandates equal access to sports for both genders. If a boy wants to swim and there's no boys' swimming program offered at his school, he is allowed to swim with the girls. The same issue came up for debate in Pennsylvania in 2013, prompted by a surge of boys playing on girls' sports teams. One survey conducted by the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association found that approximately 30% of schools reported having boys on a girls' sports team. When worried parents of girls began to protest, the state dug in its heels, taking the position that gender equity in sports means blindness to sexual difference. Pennsylvania's then Attorney General said, athletic equity is required by the Pennsylvania Equal Rights Amendment, and the ERA will not allow a rule barring boys from participating or playing on girls' sports teams, just as the ERA will not allow a rule barring girls from participating or playing on boys' sports teams. The General Counsel for the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association summed the issue up with a series of questions. When equal treatment creates fundamentally unequal and unfair competition, should gender-blind equity trump fairness? Also, if boys and girls can each and without limitation play sports designated for the other gender, does there remain any legitimacy in having teams classified by gender? If not, should the classifications be merged and all teams be considered co-ed since gender is not a limitation on which team a student plays? Such an approach would likely devastate female athletics at the high school level and is not a realistic or at least a practical option, he wrote. And I haven't even gotten to the question of biological males who self-identify as females competing on girls' teams, or the issue, as we saw last week, of a biological female who self-identifies as a boy taking male hormones, a performance-enhancing drug, competing against girls as they are. But I don't need to because it's obvious that in every single scenario, girls' sports loses out. So how did we get to this brave new gender-fluid world? How did we reach the point where Legos are banned from elementary school classrooms for gender equity reasons, where father-daughter dances are canceled for being non-inclusive, where our politicians are seriously considering making America's daughters register for the Selective Service, where rape crisis centers are fighting in court to bar biological males from entering, and where, quote, not every rape is a gender-motivated hate crime, end quote, as the judge put it in her ruling against the singer Kesha, who sued her former boss at Sony, Dr. Luke, for using his authority over her to systematically sexually assault her. This indeed is one of the most common questions I get. How did we get here? In my book, I argue that this has been unfolding before us for decades. I trace the origins of the gender identity movement all the way back to the sexual revolution, when second-wave feminists began arguing that our maleness and femaleness are socialized constructs, that the differences between the sexes are the source of social inequity. If women could just eradicate what makes us different from men, then we will have achieved social equality with them, they thought. This mentality gave us contraception, the hookup culture, and abortion, to name a few. And yet the problem with this thinking was that from the get-go, it assumed that there was something inherently flawed about women, and that the male mold was the ideal against which all things should be measured. This, I argue in the book, has had the effect of empowering men all the more and objectifying and degrading women. Don't believe me? I offer a quote from one man, an early self-professed feminist, Hugh Hefner. In an interview with Esquire, he said, "Women were the major beneficiaries of the sexual revolution. It permitted them to be natural sexual beings, as men are. That's where feminism should have been all along." Unfortunately, within feminism, there has been a Puritan prohibitionist element that is anti-sexual. Playboy is the antidote to Puritanism. In the 1950s and 60s, there were still states that outlawed birth control, so I started funding court cases to challenge that. At the same time, I helped sponsor the lower court cases that eventually led to Roe v. Wade. We were the amicus curiae in Roe v. Wade. I was a feminist before there was even such a thing as feminism. That's part of the history very few people know. Now we are living out the logical extremes of the argument that our biological sex is a random accident and that all perceptible differences between the sexes, in particular the reproductive differences, are arbitrary and socialized. We are on the final frontier of this logic. Or as the author of the forthcoming book, Burn Down the Binary, put in a recent article, the ultimate goal of the gender identity movement is to demolish, quote, the entire hetero-binary structuring of the world. This is the real struggle. But is this possible? In my book, I conclude on a more positive note, pointing to the fact that even as society on the one hand is trying so hard to deny sexual reality and institute widespread forced androgeneity, on the other hand, it is recognizing sexual difference perhaps more today than ever before. In the field of medicine, for example, scientists, doctors, and researchers are realizing they've only hit the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding how important sex is to good medicine. Pharmaceutical companies, for example, have learned that they must include both men and women in drug trials, as the female and male bodies might react completely differently to the same drug. In popular culture, the gender reveal party is all the craze, an event where expecting parents make a big to-do, either at a party or on social media, about the sex of their unborn child. The internet's most visited parenting website, Baby Center, experienced a 900% increase in threads on gender reveal parties in just 1 year. In one 6-month stretch, YouTube saw an even larger increase in gender reveal videos uploaded to the site. Single-sex education is making a major comeback. In 2004, there were only 34 single-sex public schools in America. In 2014, that number has exploded to 850, and that does not include private and parochial schools or colleges. Even some toys are getting a gender makeover, with Lego recently introducing a line of Legos tailored to girls, only to see the line become one of their best-selling, tripling their sales overall, and finally making progress towards closing that much-fretted-about Lego gender gap. Jonathan Last called its Disney Castle set, quote, a Death Star for girls, and a, quote, 4,080p step towards gender equality, the kind of set that would make a girl scream uncontrollably on Christmas morning. In many cases, women are, unsurprisingly, the drivers for more single-sex spaces, such as women-only gyms, female-only shared working spaces, and even recreational opportunities like women-only ski clubs. And sociologists are just beginning to understand the differing ways that women engage the workforce and society for the good of all. Bill Gates attributed his decision to give away almost all of his fortune in the world to the women in his life. And in a piece for the New York Times entitled, quote, Why Men Need Women, sociologist Adam Grant documents the numerous positive ways that women influence men. My personal favorite was the finding that male CEOs pay their employees less on average when their firstborn is a son, but more if their firstborn is a girl. The reality is, to quote one of the most complex celebrities in Hollywood, Beyonce Carter Knowles, that, quote, humanity requires both men and women, and we are equally important and need one another. Men and women complement each other in essential ways, and we needn't be threatened by what makes us different. To the contrary, the authentic equality between the sexes that so many on both sides of the debate are seeking is only to be found by starting with recognizing, accepting, and celebrating what makes us different. As the timeless adage goes, vive la différence. Thank you. So I think now I'm happy to take any questions anybody might have.
Hi, first off, thank you very much for your talk. My question is, thank you. My question is, to us, clearly, we do take it for granted that there are natural differences between men and women, but how would you argue that against someone on the other side? Because it seems like to every difference you point to that to us seems natural, they can just say, oh, well, it's just engineered into us by society, no matter what the difference is. So how would you respond to that? Thank you.
Well, I'd start by saying that a lot of the research, the emerging research, is finding that the differences are not at least entirely socialized. And to go back to the sex versus gender I think the word gender originated to describe the the certain aspects of our lived experience as men and women that are socialized. So to give an example, in our culture, men don't wear skirts, but in other cultures, they do. But that's an example of something that's socialized, but still does not get to the core of being a man or being a woman. In the book, I give an example of a study that came out like right before my book was going to press about toys. It was a study conducted at the University of London City Center, and they found that they were doing studies on like babies as young as 9 months old, and finding that when you put like a truck or a cooking pot in front of a girl and a boy, the boys overwhelmingly went for the gendered toy, and the same thing applied to the girls. And so these scientists who had, absolutely no skin in the political game, even they said this shows very clearly that there's certain aspects of our sex that's not socialized. I would actually encourage people to go and read the speech that got Larry Summers fired, because he goes into this a lot as well. He talks a lot about the research, especially with boys and girls, that finds that, yes, there are certain aspects of culture that are social. And he talks about, for example, women not excelling, at least to the, in equal levels at certain high levels, because of sort of innate differences between men and women, especially women's desire, which has been documented extensively by the Pew Foundation, to spend more time with their kids. So I think certainly you can look at within maleness and femaleness and find a whole spectrum of lived experiences. There are still, at the end of the day, sort of patently obvious and biological differences that, anybody in the medical field will tell you are immutable. I mean, the phrase that I kept coming across was something that Mayo Clinic uses to talk about sex, which is from womb to tomb. That they're with you from the moment of conception till the moment of your death. And those are sort of the deeper chromosomal, hormonal, reproductive realities that now we're actually trying to deny are real.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My question is, when we talk about the nuclear family and the importance of father figures, how can we protect women and champion the unique contributions that they make to civil society, while also, empowering fathers and telling them that they have an important role to play in society?
Well, again, I think this is where some sociologists are really making important contributions, like Brad Wilcox and others like him, who are finding, first of all, the effects on children of growing up without one or the other. And obviously, the more common scenario you see are children growing up without fathers. The problem is our society is actually starting to celebrate the idea of the single mother. And I think this gets back to what I was talking about with the sexual revolution. I think it's this idea that we're celebrating something that women are doing that men used to do, which is overwhelmingly be the providers for their family. So for some, I mean, when that number came out that 4 in 10 households are run by single mothers, that was like a celebratory moment for certain strands of feminism, because they saw women replacing men. But the reality is, I mean, you don't really have to look far at all to find extremely well-documented research about the effects on women of raising children without a father, definitely on children of growing up without one or the other, especially girls growing up without fathers. But then more and more evidence is coming out. And if you start to read the news with like this filter in your mind, you'll see every day there's some article, that men who are raising families without a woman in their life are more prone to depression, things like this. So clearly, I think relying on the huge body of research that's out there that shows the social cost to both sexes and to children of this, but also I think sort of celebrating the distinct roles of fathers and mothers. And I think, that's still very much possible in this postmodern world where you have any number of arrangements where, both couples may be working full time. You may have stay-at-home dad, you may have a stay-at-home mom. I think instead of sort of being threatened by that, as conservatives, it's important to step back and realize that even in all of those different scenarios, there's still, at the end of the day, distinct contributions that men and women are making in their homes.
First of all, I think you were really harsh to pizza in your remarks. Gregory T. Angelo, I'm the president of Log Cabin Republicans. On a serious note, I would want to ask, would your opinion on any of these, let me back up. some of your statements about an opposition to these constructs of gender identity was based on their vagaries, right?
Right.
Would your opinion of any of those issues change if there was a more specificity to what constituted gender identity? In other words, if a student had a note from a therapist, advisory opinions from a counselor, a doctor's note that stated that they had a recognized medical condition of gender identity dysphoria, would that change any of your opinion on those issues?
Probably not because, well, for many reasons. One, I don't dispute the reality of gender dysphoria. I think that's a real medical condition, and I'm certainly not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I don't dispute that that's a real thing. But, you know, as somebody who spent the better part of my adolescence wishing I was a boy, because I didn't identify with what I saw as, what I perceived as sort of social constructs regarding femininity. I was more likely to want to be in the politics club with the guys and, you know, wasn't super into girly things. But I'm really glad that no sort of psychologist or doctor ever pushed me in the direction. I'm increasingly hearing stories of parents whose children, for one reason or another, have wound up in some sort of psychology. And I've read that actually psychologists now cannot, I think they're not even allowed to sort of therapeutically treat that situation. In other words, if like a 7-year-old says, I think I'm a boy, they have to run with that. So I'm a little concerned at how some of these medical associations can get politically hijacked. And in the book, I talk a lot about other, you know, things that I think the medical and doctor community are signing off on that are not okay, such as like plastic surgeries on young girls that don't even have to do with gender dysphoria, but other things like that. I mean, I certainly think there's a real need to be sort of charitable in our approach to people who are going through that, and in recognizing that that is a very hard and difficult thing to go through with. But especially when it comes to children, I get very uncomfortable. You know, I just think childhood is, a hallmark of childhood is confusion. And that is a natural and normal thing. And I think we're not going to help children by essentially encouraging that confusion, especially when we give it sort of the stamp of the medical community. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, my name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is that since you are involved with this movement or this subject, do you think that President Trump would issue an executive order that no federal fund should be used for any sex change? I mean, whatever people believe as a taxpayer, I feel offended that my money is being due just because somebody is confused and claiming, oh, I'm just opposite of my sex, what actually I am. So I don't want to waste a penny on this thing. If that person wants to do that, more power to him or her, but taxpayers' dollars shouldn't be used for that purpose. So my question is, again, do you think Donald Trump can issue executive order about this? Thanks.
I think it's conceivable. I think if there's one thing President Trump has made clear, it's trying to eliminate wasteful government spending. So I could certainly see that falling into that category.
Hi, my name's Tom Booth, and I'm a trained Special Forces operator. I spent 8 years in Special Forces 8 detachments, and I'm a combat veteran as well. And I'm still heavily plugged into this community, and we have real concerns now. The Special Forces qualification course, theoretically, is open for women to attend. The problem is, as a Special Forces radio operator, my rucksack weighed in excess of 100 pounds. I weighed 190 pounds in field trim. Then there's my vest. There's all sorts of other weights. So you're looking at like a composite of like 320 pounds moving on 2 legs. And when I go down, like the woman sitting next to me is a very fit woman, but there's no possibility she could fire carry. She could put me in a fire carrier and get me away from the gunfire. So then there's the other physical things that go with it. And special operations right now is carrying the fight. We're the ones taking the casualties in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The rest of the military has been standing down. We're sent to the worst places to meet the worst people. It's extremely high stress, and it's an ugly world that we live in while we're operators. And where's the sanity to this? Why do we have to force this down our throats? And how does this raise combat effectiveness? How does it help us? Do you think there's any potential that the military is going to stop this nonsense fairly soon?
Well, thanks for your question and thank you for your service. I think it's certainly plausible, and I think you raise a lot of the issues that, it was I was sort of shocked when I was doing the research on my chapter in the military as to how many active members of the military were speaking out against what was happening, which I think is sort of uncommon for the military, a big part of which is sort of, staying in line and not questioning things from above. But it was clear there was a lot of unease going on about all of this. And, I think the military is a good example of, I talked to a lot of people who are in the military, and many of them made the argument that women can't rise in the ranks in the military unless they have combat experience, and that this is something that's sort of holding women back. And so I think rather than trying to force women to do things that on average, certainly there are women who are exceptions to the norm, but they're extremely rare. And even in the study that the Marines did, the women that they chose, they sort of selected like an average range of performance for men for the study, but chose sort of the top 1% of women. And even those women still, and some of the women actually spoke out, because I believe it was Ash Carter or it was maybe it was Ray, I think it was Ray Mabus, who said the study had been rigged and that they hadn't chosen the standout women. And the women were like, excuse me, I am a standout woman, and that's insulting. And everybody was insulted by the idea that the study was rigged. But no, I think, I was interested because I looked at not just the military, but firefighting and police. And firefighting, you have a similar issue as you do with military combat, which is that basically the quality that you most need is physical strength and the ability to carry somebody wounded off the field, the ability to fire a ginormous weapon with extreme accuracy, things like that. Things that women just struggle to do. And not just that, but actually by pushing women into these roles, we're putting them at greater risk, because we know that their bodies can't even sustain just carrying around the pack. In the firefighting chapter, I talk about just women going through the training were coming out and then winding up on disability because it was so hard on their bodies to have to carry around all this equipment. But contrast that to other types of first responders, such as police, where actually women, as soon as you give them a gun, they're sort of on an equal playing field with an assailant or with their fellow male police officers. And that so much of what policing is about is de-escalating violent situations, skills where women actually bring something to the table that men don't. And I talk about the fact that, a lot of people are saying maybe the solution to our problem with police brutality is getting more women in there, because, they know if it's me against some 250-pound guy, just like a physical fight, he's going to beat me, so I've got to use my wits to talk him down out of this situation. But I do think that, I think it was General Mattis, actually, who was very outspoken against all of this. I know he's on the outs, but I certainly think his reservations about what was happening were shared, and I think this photo scandal is really getting the attention of even the left-wing media about, wait a minute, maybe we're accelerating too fast with this. But I think it's unfair to women at the end of the day to say that you're not an equal soldier with a man unless you can perform the most sort of extremely physically rigorous roles, which even in the military, not all men are physically qualified to do. So we're sort of holding women soldiers to the highest, sort of most macho male standard, which is setting them up to fail, setting them up to be more likely to be injured, more likely to die, and potentially risking everybody's lives as well as our military readiness. So I think it is certainly plausible that this administration will take a closer look at the really rapid changes that happened under the last in the military.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Do you have a recommendation for the state and for the schools and for the athletes involved? The female school wrestler trying to become a male, taking drugs, it's giving an unfair advantage but the state is saying has to compete as a female. I mean, I know I was disturbed when, as a baseball fan, you know, with athletes getting an unfair advantage with steroids. But I mean, what is your evaluation of that?
Well, I certainly think there should be a hard and fast rule about biological sexes competing with each other. And, you know, I have a whole section on this in the book, but what's interesting is that even a lot of left-wing feminists agree with that, especially women who sort of pioneered female athletics, because they can see, you know, really the argument for having women's sports dissolves really fast as soon as you're arguing that sex is not a valid category for essentially separating the sports in terms of teams. But I mean, the case of the wrestler was interesting. I think people got confused. They thought it was a biological male competing against other females. We've seen other cases of this in different sports, but this was actually a biological female who was taking testosterone. And I think, you know, these athletic institutions already have rules against taking performance-enhancing drugs. So I feel like the rules are already in place, and either we're going to throw them all to the wind and let everybody take performance-enhancing drugs and let either sex play on whatever team they want, which is kind of the direction that we're going, or we're just going to observe the rules that we already have in place. And, you know, that to me is sort of the simple solution to that. Yeah. Sure.
Ken Dillon, Cincia Press. Is this problem specific to the United States, or is it an international problem and cross-cultural problem?
In terms of legal and social policy, I certainly know in a lot of Western countries, you're seeing similar issues crop up. I'm not sure quite to the colorful degree you're seeing in the United States, but I give the example of the British Medical Association also falling prey to some of this sort of PC sensitivities about how we talk about pregnant women. So, you know, I really can only speak to that. I don't have the best answer to your question, but I think it's certainly permeating much of the sort of Western world, if you will.
Based on this argument, how would you reconcile the need to recognize these biological differences between men and women and the potential outcomes of that with this struggle and this movement for equality of opportunity? Like, so I think that argument, the argument that you make is great. One potential fallout I could see in places like Saudi Arabia, one justification given for women, you know, not being able to drive a car is, oh, you know, women are more prone to be assaulted on the road. So I could see some potential like downfalls there too.
Okay, that's a good and interesting question. And actually, I think one thing we're seeing in the United States is some of these quests for social equality being undercut by the gender neutrality thing. So I'll start with that first. I'll give the example of Ivanka Trump and the paid maternity leave plan that she helped her father put out. She got raked over the coals because it actually emphasized women. In fact, I think it was just about women, the plan that she had proposed. There was nothing in there for fathers, or maybe it was less. And a lot of people were very angry with her that it didn't offer equal leave for fathers and mothers. And she was like, look, what women go through is different than what men go through. And just saying that was actually hugely controversial. I mean, almost all of these like women's magazines and even, you know, like NPR, I mean, they just went after her for that. To the point that I think she was a little sort of flustered, like, why am I even defending this reality? But actually what was interesting was that not long before that, a study had come out that found that in the university setting, when you offer male professors and female professors identical paid leave, it actually hurts women, which makes sense because essentially all you're really doing is sort of just like paying everybody a little bit more while keeping everything equal in society. And men have sort of, I mean, women physically, emotionally, are much more vulnerable for a long time after childbearing, especially if they're doing things like breastfeeding, things like that. So it was sort of like, it actually gives men a leg up because they're getting, 6 months time off, but they're not breastfeeding. They're probably not getting up as much as the women. They're certainly not, still struggling to walk around, things like that. So I think actually a lot of these issues that are considered more progressive quests for equality between men and women are not attainable, especially even just the idea of, not being able to discriminate against women for getting pregnant. I mean, if we can't even say pregnant woman, how are women going to actually be able to make claims? And actually, this is where you're seeing left-wing feminists line up with social conservatives in agreement that we're all sort of concerned about the status of women in a world where sex is not a valid category. I mean, what happens to rape? I mean, this is sort of a crazy question, but sort of not, because the reason rape is considered such a heinous crime is because it's the one sex taking advantage of the other sexually in a way that's particularly egregious. And I give the example in the book of the judge in Kesha's case making this weird, I'm not sure what she meant, but it gets at what I think we're all sort of concerned about is, I mean, obviously there's cases of sexual assault against, by men against men, but certainly there's not, rape is a one-way street, but is it in a world where we're all the same, in other words? So to your point about Saudi Arabia, I mean, I think we have to sort of differentiate between that's an example of, I think a lot of people get concerned about, well, you just want to take us back to the 1950s where we had these super gender roles and women were excluded from all of these places. And no, I mean, the reality is we have to understand the things about us that are actually the same, which is our intelligence, our ability to, make political choices, voting, our ability to contribute to civil society, participate in civil society. We may do that in different ways, but at the end of the day, there's certain sort of baseline rights that have to be in place in order for us to equally contribute in those ways. So that's recognizing what's the same about us, which there certainly are a category of things that are truly the same about us. But, I'd say that there's certainly a broad section of qualities about us that are quite different and require society to recognize that in order for men to not be able to oppress women. Any other questions? I wanted to make one more point about your question about socialization and gender, because I do actually think, I talk about this in the book, I talk about the princess culture and how I think there's certain aspects of socialization that people are uncomfortable with for good reasons. But I often, what I go back and forth in my mind about is how much of that is sort of consumerism and corporatism. And this is not exactly what you asked, but I don't want to say that it's totally unfair to always be, concerned about sort of external pressures on boys and girls to be a certain way. And, for example, it's kind of funny that my cover is a Barbie because I don't let my daughter play with Barbies. I sort of don't like Barbies. And I know that Barbie has actually tried to remake itself and redo the body so that it's not like a completely warped image of a woman. And that's not to say I would stop my daughter from playing with dolls, but even like the Disney culture, I think, I think a lot of parents are really vigilant about this, and this is interesting, again, where you're seeing sort of social conservatives and left-wing feminists. I think social conservatives might not like seeing, the sort of sexuality of, especially the way, like, females in Disney are increasingly portrayed as, like, hypersexual or damsels in distress, and you see the same thing on the left. But then, so I never let my daughter see Frozen. And then somehow, I don't even understand. She knows all the words to Frozen, has a Frozen dress, has a Frozen doll. And so I think there's sort of like an innate inclination for girls to celebrate their individuality. And that tends to manifest into the princess culture. But then there's aspects of it that, the princess culture is like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's hard to escape as parents. So this is just to say that I think, there's raising questions about some of that does not mean, you're raising questions about should girls be allowed to dress like a princess or the other way around. But that was another thought that I had. So
please join me in thanking Ashley.
Yeah, thank you.